Hey guys, welcome back. If you're just tuning in for the first time, this is the place where history gets told slowly, quietly, and without any of the energy that you definitely don't have right now. So go ahead and put your phone down somewhere comfortable. Maybe dim the screen a little. Pull whatever blanket situation you've got going on a little closer. Tonight we're going somewhere very, very old. And I mean old. Not, oh, that building is from the 1800s old. I mean old in the way that makes your brain sort of quietly give up trying to picture it. We're talking about a group of people, or rather, a collection of related peoples who lived, migrated, argued, and occasionally invented things somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago, maybe more. Scholars are still working that part out, and honestly, they've been working it out for about 200 years, which is its own kind of exhausting. Tonight, we're going on a calm journey through what historians, linguists, and archaeologists broadly call the Aryan civilization, or, more precisely, the Indo-European world, because the word Aryan has had quite a journey itself, from a fairly neutral ancient term, meaning something like noble or civilized people, through centuries of being used by actual ancient cultures to describe themselves, and then into one of the most catastrophically misused concepts in modern history. We'll get to all of that gently, at a pace that matches your slowly closing eyelids. This isn't going to be a story with a villain, or a hero, really. It's more like watching a very slow river, this enormous movement of peoples, languages, horses, and ideas that spread across an almost incomprehensible geography over thousands of years. The kind of story that doesn't have a dramatic climax. It just unfolds, which is perfect for tonight. So let's begin at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as anyone can figure out. Somewhere around 4500 to 3500 BCE, which is a range of 1,000 years because ancient history is generous like that. There was a group of people living in a region that scholars call the Pontic-Caspian Steppe. If you're not immediately picturing that, don't worry. It's essentially the vast flat grassland region that stretches across what is now southern Ukraine, southern Russia, and northern Kazakhstan. Big sky country, lots of grass, remarkably few trees. These people didn't call themselves anything that we know of, which is kind of poetic. We call them Proto-Indo-Europeans, which is a term that sounds like something you'd find in a very dry academic journal, and honestly, that's exactly where it came from. They are, in the gentlest possible sense, the ancestral population from which an enormous number of later civilizations would descend. Languages from Iceland to Sri Lanka trace back in some form to whatever those steppe people were saying to each other while they looked out at the endless grass. We don't have any of their writing because they didn't have writing. We have their bones, sometimes. We have traces of their culture in the languages that came after them. We have what archaeologists have found in their burial mounds, the kurgans, those low grassy hills that dot the steppe even today. And from all of that, linguists and archaeologists have spent roughly 2 centuries trying to reconstruct who these people were. It's a bit like trying to describe a painting when all you have are the brushes that were used to make it. Possible, sort of. but you have to squint. What we do know, or at least strongly suspect, is that these Proto-Indo-European people were pastoralists. That means they herded animals, cattle, sheep, goats. They moved with their herds across the steppe in a fairly mobile lifestyle, which is actually a pretty efficient way to live on flat grassland if you think about it. The steppe doesn't exactly reward people who try to stay in one place and grow wheat. It rewards people who keep moving. And then, around 3500 to 3000 BCE, something happened that would change everything. Not in a dramatic Hollywood explosion way, more in a quiet, world-altering, this takes centuries to fully appreciate way. They domesticated the horse. Now, horses had existed in the region for a long time. People had been hunting them for meat, which honestly sounds like a terrible waste in retrospect. But at some point, and scholars still debate exactly when and where, one figured out that you could ride one. And then someone else figured out that you could harness several of them to a wheeled vehicle. And suddenly, people who had been walking slowly across the steppe were now moving at a speed that no other culture on Earth could match. The wheel, by the way, also shows up in this cultural sphere around the same period, which is either a remarkable coincidence or a sign that whoever these people were, they had a particular talent for transportation innovation. The wheel and the horse together created a kind of mobility that transformed what it was possible for a human group to do in their lifetime. You could cover more ground. You could raid more effectively. You could trade over longer distances. You could, if you felt so inclined, pick up your entire community and move it somewhere completely different in a matter of weeks rather than months. And so they did, over centuries, over millennia. Slowly, in waves, in trickles, in small family groups and larger migrations, the descendants of these Pontic steppe people began moving outward, south, east, and west, into lands that already had people in them, which is one of those uncomfortable historical facts that tends to make the story more complicated. Let's stay with the steppe for a little longer, because there are a few archaeological cultures worth knowing about if you want to understand this migration story. And I promise this will be delivered at a pace that is gentle on the brain. The Yamnaya culture, that name comes from the Russian word for pit, because they buried their dead in pit graves, flourished roughly from 3300 to 2600 BCE. They were the classic kurgan builders, those steppe pastoralists with horses and wheeled carts and a lifestyle centered around movement. Genetic studies in recent decades have been remarkably illuminating about the Yamnaya. It turns out that their genetic signature shows up with varying intensity in populations all across Europe and Asia. They weren't invisible in the archaeological record. They were just hard to spot until modern DNA analysis came along. The Yamnaya expanded westward into Europe in a significant way, and the genetic evidence suggests that in some parts of Europe, particularly in the north and west, this expansion was rather substantial. The people who were there before, the early European farmers who had themselves come from Anatolia thousands of years earlier, found their genetic contribution significantly diluted over time. These things happen when Large, mobile, horse-riding people with cattle herds move into an area. It's not always violent. It's often just demographic. People marry, populations mix, and over generations the balance shifts. To the east, related groups moved toward Central Asia, toward the Bactria-Margiana region, toward South Asia, toward the Iranian plateau. The same basic story told in different directions. The corded ware culture in northern and central Europe, roughly 2900 to 2350 BCE, shows that characteristic Yamnaya ancestry and is generally considered to represent expansion taking root and developing into something new. They made pottery with cord impressions, which is where the name comes from. They also buried their dead in gendered ways, men on their right sides, women on their left, both with their heads oriented in particular directions. This level of cultural consistency across a wide area suggests a shared origin and shared belief system that archaeology is only beginning to fully understand. All of this is to say, these migrations were real, they were significant, and they left traces that are still detectable thousands of years later, not just in bones and DNA, but in words. The linguistic evidence is, in many ways, the most elegant part of this story, certainly the most sleep-friendly, because it involves a lot of careful, patient comparison of verb conjugations and noun declensions, which is soothing in the same way that listening to someone alphabetize their bookshelf is soothing. In the late 18th century, British judge named William Jones was sitting in Calcutta, because that's where British judges tended to sit in the 1780s, and he was studying Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, and he noticed something remarkable. Sanskrit bore striking resemblances to Latin, to Greek, to Gothic, to Celtic languages. The word for father in Sanskrit is patar, in Latin, pater, in Greek, pater, in Old English, a fader. These aren't coincidences. These are family resemblances in the most literal sense. Jones gave a famous lecture in 1786 in which he proposed that Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, and the Gothic languages all descended from a common source. He was right, and his observations set off about 200 years of comparative linguistics that is still going on today. The reconstructed ancestor language, Proto-Indo-European, or PIE, can be partially reconstructed by comparing the descendant languages and working backward to find what the common forms must have been. It's a bit like looking at a family of siblings and working out what their grandparents must have looked like, based on which features all the siblings share. Proto-Indo-European had words for things like cattle, sheep, horse, wheel, and axle, which tells you something about the people who spoke it. They lived in a world where these things were important enough to need everyday words. They had words for seasonal cycles, for different kinds of relationships, for wool and weaving. They had, scholars believe, a word for the sky as a deity, something like Darius Pitaitir, meaning sky father, which shows up later as Zeus in Greek, Dios Pita in Sanskrit, and Jupiter in Latin. Three completely different civilizations, separated by enormous distances, all preserving in slightly modified form the same ancient name for the same ancient god. That's the kind of detail that, if you let it settle in slowly in the dark, is genuinely remarkable. Now, the word Aryan itself, let's spend a little quiet time here, because it matters and it's been badly mishandled and it deserves a calm explanation. In the ancient Vedic texts of South Asia, the Rigveda and its companions, which are among the oldest religious texts still in use anywhere on earth, the word Arya appears frequently. It refers to people of a particular cultural and religious tradition. In the Avesta, the ancient Iranian religious texts, a related word Arya is used in a similar way. The ancient Iranians, in fact, named their land Aryana Vyaja, something like the expanse of the Aryans, which eventually became Iran. The name Iran is directly derived from this ancient word. So in ancient usage, Aryan was essentially a cultural and sometimes ethnic self-designation used by the ancient peoples of northern India and Iran. It did not mean a race in the modern scientific sense. It did not mean blonde hair and blue eyes. It meant, roughly, someone of the right culture, the right tradition, the right religious practice. The opposite of an Arya was a Dasa or Daju. The outsider, the foreigner, the one who didn't share the customs. This was a cultural distinction, not a biological one. The ancient speakers of Vedic Sanskrit who composed the Rigveda were, genetically, a mixture of steppe ancestry and South Asian ancestry. As modern genetic studies have shown, they were not a racially pure group by any definition. They were the product of exactly the kind of mixing that large-scale migration and contact always used to bruises, and much later, the word got picked up by European scholars in the 19th century, and then by European nationalists, and then by one particular group of European nationalists who took it to its most catastrophic extreme in the 20th century, which we'll address properly when we get there. But for now, in the context of ancient history, Aryan just means the people who called themselves that, who lived in northern India and Iran, who were part of this larger Indo-European expansion story, and whose culture produced some remarkable things. Let's float now toward the culture that arguably left the most complete record, the Vedic civilization of South Asia, somewhere around 2000 to 1500 BCE. Again, a range, because ancient history, groups with steppe ancestry, began moving into or through the region that is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. They were coming from Central Asia, where related groups had already been living for some centuries in what archaeologists call the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, or BMAC. The BMAC was a remarkable Bronze Age civilization in its own right, with walled settlements and sophisticated material culture, and the incoming steppe people interacted with it in complex ways. These movements eventually brought Indo-Aryan speaking peoples into the northwestern Indian subcontinent, the Punjab, and the Indus Valley region. Now, the Indus Valley already had a very sophisticated urban civilization, the Harappan civilization, which at its height, around 2500 to 2000 BCE, was one of the largest and most organized urban cultures on Earth. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were cities with grid-planned streets, sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and a writing system that has never been deciphered. They were doing things that most of the ancient world hadn't figured out yet. And then, for reasons that scholars still debate, climate change drought, disruption of trade networks, possibly some combination, the Harappan civilization went into decline. By around 1900 BCE, it was in significant decay. By 1700 BCE, the great urban centers were largely abandoned. The timing of this decline and the arrival of Indo-Aryan speakers in the region is one of the great debates of South Asian archaeology. For a long time, scholars proposed an Aryan invasion that destroyed the Harappan civilization. Modern scholarship has largely moved away from the dramatic invasion model. The picture that emerges from genetics, archaeology, and linguistics is more gradual. Migrations and interactions over centuries, not a single destructive conquest. The Harappan decline seems to have been well underway before significant steppe ancestry shows up in the genetic record of the region. But the Indo-Aryan speakers did arrive, and they did bring their language, their horses, their cattle, their rituals, and their hymns. And somewhere in the Punjab, probably between 1500 and 1200 BCE, those hymns were composed, refined, and eventually fixed into the collection we know as the Rigveda. The Rigveda is extraordinary. There is no other word for it. It is a collection of 1,028 hymns organized into 10 books, addressed to various deities, composed in a language of remarkable poetic sophistication, and preserved through an oral tradition of such meticulous care that the text we have today is almost certainly identical to the text that was being recited 3,000 years ago. Every syllable, every accent mark, every pause was memorized and transmitted with an accuracy that modern scholars find almost incomprehensible. The people who composed and preserved these hymns lived a life that the texts describe with considerable vividness. They had cattle, lots of cattle, because cattle were basically the currency and measure of all good things. Prayers in the Rigveda often ask the gods for cattle, lots of cattle, more cattle, the best possible cattle, a prayer that essentially boils down to, "Please give us a really good herd," appears in a remarkable number of variations, which tells you what mattered. They also had horses. Horses were prestigious, important, associated with power and the gods and the movements of the sun across the sky. The horse sacrifice, the Ashvamedha, was the ultimate royal ritual, a ceremony so elaborate and symbolically loaded that it turns up in texts repeatedly over centuries. A horse was released to wander for a year, accompanied by warriors, and wherever it wandered, the king claimed sovereignty. At the end of the year, the horse was sacrificed in a ceremony that involved more ritual complexity than most modern events departments could manage. They had a sky deity, Dyaus-Pita, that ancient sky father, though by the time of the Rigveda his prominence had already faded somewhat compared to newer, more active gods like Indra, the storm god, the divine warrior, the slayer of the serpent Vritra, who had held back the waters. Indra is magnificent in the Rigveda. He's loud, he drinks enormous amounts of the sacred ritual drink soma. He fights cosmic battles. He's enormously powerful and more than a little chaotic. He is, in short, exactly the kind of deity you'd expect from a culture of mobile pastoralists with horses and a fondness for cattle raiding. Soma, by the way, is one of the great mysteries of ancient studies. The Rigveda describes it extensively, It's a plant, it's pressed and filtered, it's mixed with milk and water, it's drunk by priests and gods alike. It produces a state of divine inspiration and elevated consciousness. The god Soma is also personified as a deity in his own right. What was it exactly? Scholars have been arguing about this for over a century. Candidates have included the hallucinogenic fly agaric mushroom, various species of ephedra, harmaline-containing plants, cannabis, and several others. The argument continues. The text is descriptive but not taxonomically precise enough to settle the matter. What is clear is that Soma was central to the Vedic ritual system. Without it, the major rituals couldn't properly be performed. There are hymns dedicated entirely to its preparation and consumption. There are descriptions of its effects that suggest something genuinely psychoactive. Whatever it was, it mattered enormously to the people who drank it while composing some of the oldest poetry in human history. Let that settle in for a moment. 3,000 years ago, somewhere in the Punjab, someone sat down, or stood up, or paced, after drinking a mysterious sacred plant preparation, and composed a hymn to the dawn that is still considered one of the most beautiful pieces of Sanskrit poetry ever written. The Usha's hymns, addressed to the goddess of dawn, are genuinely lovely. She shines upon us like a young woman, goes one roughly, rousing every living being to go to his task. 3,000 years old, still there. The social structure of Vedic society, as described in the texts, was organized around what would eventually become the famous Varna system, the fourfold division of society into Brahmins, priests and scholars, Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers, Vaishyas, farmers, merchants, herders, and Shudras, laborers and servants. The word Varna means color in Sanskrit, which has generated enormous amounts of scholarly and political debate about whether it originally referred to skin tone or was purely metaphorical, or both or neither. The origins of this system and its relationship to the social structure of the incoming Indo-Aryan speakers versus the existing population of South Asia are deeply contested and politically sensitive. What seems clear is that the system solidified over time, became associated with birth and heredity rather than purely occupation, and developed into the caste system that shaped South Asian society for millennia. That development was gradual and complex, and it wasn't entirely the product of any single group or migration. The later text, called the Purusha Sukta, a hymn in the 10th book of the Rigveda, describes the four Varnas as arising from the sacrifice of a primordial cosmic being, the Purusha. Brahmins from his mouth, Kshatriyas from his arms, Vaishyas from his thighs, Shudras from his feet. It's a creation myth and a social charter simultaneously, which is a remarkably efficient use of a single hymn. Outside the Varna system, and in a position that the texts make clear was below all of them, were people classified as untouchable, associated with tasks considered ritually polluting. This is one of the darker aspects of the Vedic social legacy, and it deserves to be named plainly even in a bedtime history script. The people who performed work considered impure, dealing with death, leather, certain kinds of cleaning, were placed outside the social hierarchy in a way that justified their systematic marginalization for thousands of years. The consequences of that system are still felt today. Ancient history is rarely innocent, and the Aryan civilization story is not innocent either. We can appreciate the poetry and the philosophy and the linguistic sophistication while also being clear-eyed about the social structures that were built alongside them. Let's drift now toward the geography, because the Vedic people weren't just sitting in one place composing hymns. They were moving, expanding, settling, arguing, fighting, composing more hymns about the fighting, and generally spreading across northern India over the course of several centuries. The Rigveda describes a world centered on the Sapta Sindhu, the seven rivers region, which corresponds roughly to the Punjab and the northwestern subcontinent. The rivers mentioned, the Indus, the Sarasvati, and others, are identifiable with real rivers, though the Sarasvati, the most sacred in the texts, is now believed to correspond to a river system that has since dried up or changed course. Satellite imagery and geological surveys have found the dried bed of what may have been a substantial river in the area. Where the text described the Sarasvati, the river dried up, the civilization moved east, and the texts preserved the memory of a landscape that no longer exists. By the time of the later Vedic texts, the Yajurveda, the Samaveda, the Atharvaveda, and the Brahmanas that accompanied them, the center of gravity had shifted east toward the Ganges plain. The Kuru and Panchala kingdoms of the upper Ganges region became the new heartland of Vedic culture. The rituals became more elaborate, the texts more voluminous, the philosophical reflection deeper. And somewhere in this later Vedic period, probably around 900 to 600 BCE, the great forest treatises called the Aranyakas and then the Upanishads began to be composed. And with the Upanishads, something genuinely new happened in the history of human thought. The Upanishads, there are traditionally 108 of them, though the principal ones number about a dozen, are philosophical dialogues, questions and answers, meditations on the nature of reality. They ask the questions that philosophy always asks. What is the self? What is the universe? What is the relationship between the two? What happens after death? What is the nature of consciousness? And the answers they arrive at are remarkable. The central insight of the Upanishads is often summarized in the formula Tattvamasi, that thou art. The individual self, the Atman, is ultimately identical with the universal ground of being, Brahman. The apparent separation between the individual and the cosmos is a kind of ignorance, an illusion, Maya. Liberation comes from recognizing this identity. This is a sophisticated philosophical position, arrived at through meditation and reflection rather than empirical science, and it anticipates certain ideas in Western philosophy that wouldn't be formulated for another 1,000 years. The Greek philosopher Plotinus, writing in the 3rd century CE, developed ideas about the soul's unity with the one that bears striking similarities to Upanishadic thought. Whether this is convergence or influence is another of those debates that scholars conduct in comfortable armchairs. The Upanishads also contain beautiful passages that are simply worth knowing about as human artifacts. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of the oldest, contains a remarkable dialogue between the philosopher Yajnavalkya and his wife Maitreyi, in which she asks him, if she had all the wealth in the world, would she achieve immortality? And he says no. And she says, then what is the use of wealth? Tell me what leads to immortality instead. And he does, in a long and complex teaching about the nature of the self. A woman asking a philosopher for the path to immortality in a text written somewhere around 800 to 600 BCE. It's one of those small details that cuts across 3,000 years and feels immediate around the same time as the later Vedic period, or slightly after, depending on which scholar you ask, because chronology in ancient history is always depending on which scholar you ask. Another great development was happening further west on the Iranian plateau, because the Indo-Aryan migrations didn't only go toward India, they also went toward Iran, and the people who ended up in Iran, speaking what would become the Iranian branch of the Indo-European family, developed their own distinct civilization, their own distinct religious tradition, and their own distinct version of some of those ancient Proto-Indo-European ideas. The Iranians of the Avestan texts used a language closely related to Vedic Sanskrit, close enough that scholars can read them side by side and see the family resemblance in real time. The Avestan word for a class of divine beings, Daiva, corresponds to the Sanskrit word Deva, meaning God. But here's where it gets interesting. In Vedic Sanskrit, Deva means God, the good guys. In Avestan Iranian, Daiva means demon, the bad guys. Somewhere in the split between the Indo-Aryan and Iranian branches, there was a theological disagreement profound enough that the gods of one tradition became the demons of the other. This inversion is one of the most fascinating puzzles in comparative religion, and it's directly connected to the figure of Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, the prophet and reformer of ancient Iranian religion. But that story belongs to the next part of our journey, and your eyes are probably getting appropriately heavy. So for now, let's just sit with the image of those Pontic steppe people 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, looking out at the grass, with their horses and their cattle and their wheeled carts, and their language full of words for sky gods and sacred drinks, moving slowly outward in all directions, carrying with them, without knowing it, the seeds of Sanskrit and Greek and Latin and Persian and 100 other languages, the seeds of the Vedas and the Avesta and Homer and the Roman legal code. They didn't know any of that, of course. They were probably just looking for better grazing land. History has a way of being much larger than the people making it. Still here? Good. We're going to keep moving slowly through this enormous story. We left off with the Proto-Indo-European migrations spreading outward from the Pontic steppe, and we took a long, quiet look at the Vedic civilization of South Asia. Now let's turn west, or rather southwest, toward the Iranian plateau. Iran, the name, as we mentioned, comes from Aryana, land of the Aryans, is a vast, mostly arid plateau surrounded by mountain ranges, with the Zagros Mountains to the west, the Alborz to the north, and various desert basins in between. It's not the easiest landscape to build a civilization on, and yet people did, repeatedly and impressively. The Iranian branch of the Indo-European migrations brought steppe ancestry people into this region over several centuries. They mixed with the existing populations of the plateau, who were themselves quite old and sophisticated, and eventually produced the cultural and linguistic ancestors of the Medes, the Persians, the Parthians, the Sogdians, and various other Iranian-speaking peoples who would, over time, build some of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. But before the empires, there was the religion. And the religion, in the Iranian case, is particularly interesting. Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, in the older Iranian form of his name, is one of the most important religious figures in human history, which is a somewhat ironic fact, given that most people in the modern world know his name primarily from Nietzsche's "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," a 19th century philosophical work that used his name but had essentially nothing to do with him. Nietzsche himself acknowledged this in a typically Nietzschean way. The real Zarathustra lived, probably. The dating is contested, as it always is. Some scholars put him as early as 1500 to 1000 BCE, in the same rough period as the later Vedic texts. Others put him as late as 600 BCE. The later dating would make him a contemporary of the Buddha and Confucius, which would make the 6th century BCE quite the century for religious innovation, and indeed, some historians have noted this clustering of prophets and philosophers as a remarkable phenomenon. Karl Jaspers called it the axial age, a period when human consciousness seemed to make a great leap forward in several places at once. Whenever he lived, Zarathustra was, according to the Zoroastrian tradition, a priest, or at least someone with priestly training, who received a revelation. The Gathas, the 17 hymns of the Avesta that are attributed directly to Zarathustra himself, are written in a first-person voice of striking intensity. He describes a vision of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, the supreme deity of his reformed religion, and he describes his mission to teach the truth, to combat the lie, to reform a religion he considered corrupted. The theological system that Zarathustra introduced, or, if you prefer, revealed, is fascinating. It's a dualistic system, one of the first clearly dualistic religions in human history. On one side, Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, associated with truth, light, order, goodness. On this other side, Angra Mainyu, the dissociated with the lie, darkness, chaos, evil. The cosmic history of the universe is the story of this struggle between these two principles, and every human being participates in it through their own choices. The Avestan word for truth is Asha. The word for the lie, the opposition to cosmic order, is Druj. These aren't abstract concepts, they're active forces in the world. To speak truthfully, to act rightly, to align yourself with cosmic order, this is Asha. To deceive, to break oaths, to act destructively, this is Druj. The moral and the cosmic are the same. This ethical dualism, the idea that the universe is fundamentally a struggle between good and evil, and that human moral choices matter cosmically, would prove enormously influential. Elements of it appear in later Jewish thought during the Persian period, when Jewish communities were living under Persian rule and in close contact with Zoroastrian ideas. From there, they influenced early Christianity's concepts of Satan and cosmic spiritual warfare. The Zoroastrian influence on the Abrahamic religions is a thread that runs quietly through the history of Western religion and is rarely acknowledged enough. Zoroastrianism also had remarkably progressive features for its time. Animals should be treated well. Agriculture and irrigation are holy activities because they fight the dryness of the demonic world. Women could be priests in some traditions. The afterlife involved judgment based on one's deeds, good thoughts, good words, good actions being the threefold Zoroastrian ethic. The soul crossed a bridge after death, the Chinvat Bridge, which was wide for the righteous and narrow as a blade for the wicked. Not a hell of eternal punishment exactly, but a sorting system based on merit. The Zoroastrian tradition also had its own sacred plant preparation, homa, which is clearly the same word as the Vedic soma, just run through a few thousand years of linguistic change. The Iranian and Indian branches of the Indo-European family shared this ancient ritual and its vocabulary, even as they inverted the moral valence of each other's gods. It's as if the two branches of a family had a falling out, stopped speaking to each other, called each other's ancestors demons, but kept making grandma's recipe for the sacred holiday drink. There's something almost comforting about that. The Avestan texts that preserve Zoroastrian tradition are complex and multi-layered, composed over many centuries. The oldest parts, the Gathas, are archaic and difficult even for scholars of the language. The later parts, the Yasna, the Yashts, the Vendidad, are more accessible and describe a rich ritual and mythological system. The Yashts are particularly beautiful, hymns to various divine figures like Mithra, the deity of covenants and contracts, who would later have his own dedicated cult in the Roman Empire, and Anahita, the goddess of waters and fertility. The Vendidad, by contrast, is a legal text dealing with ritual purity, a subject the Zoroastrians took very seriously. It contains detailed regulations about how to handle everything from corpses to dogs, because Zoroastrianism had a particularly warm spot for dogs who were considered sacred and ritually important. Harming a dog was a serious offense under Zoroastrian law. If you were a dog in ancient Iran, you were doing well. Now, Zoroastrianism didn't emerge in a vacuum. It emerged among people who already had a polytheistic religious tradition, the same ancient Indo-Iranian tradition shared with the Vedic world, and Zarathustra's reforms were partly a response to that tradition. He seems to have objected to excessive cattle sacrifice and to the worship of the Deva class of gods, redirecting worship toward Ahura Mazda as the supreme deity with lesser divine figures. The Amesha, Spentas, or holy immortals, serving as his divine emanations. This makes Zoroastrianism something close to a monotheism, or at least a strong henotheism, which is a word that means worship of one God while acknowledging others may exist. The theological status of Angra Mainyu in relation to Ahura Mazda was debated for centuries within the tradition. If Ahura Mazda is all good and all-powerful, how did Angra Mainyu come to exist? The tradition wrestled with this question in sophisticated ways, producing what scholars consider some of the first formal theodicy. The attempt to explain how evil exists in a universe governed by a good deity. These are questions that would be asked again in every subsequent monotheistic tradition. Zoroastrianism asked them first, or at least asked them earlier, and in a more systematic form than anyone else we have clear evidence for. Eventually, Zoroastrianism would become the official religion of some of the most powerful empires the ancient world produced. But before we get to the empires, let's linger for a moment on the people who built the world in which those empires became possible. Because the story of ancient Iran isn't just about religion and language. It's also about organization. The Iranian plateau and the wider world of ancient West Asia was a place where some of the most important administrative innovations in human history developed. Not by the Indo-European speakers alone, far from it, but the interaction between the incoming Iranian-speaking peoples and the deeply rooted civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Elamites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, produced a kind of administrative synthesis that the eventual Persian Empire would bring to its fullest expression. Before Persia, there were the Medes. The Medes were an Iranian-speaking people who consolidated power in what is now northwestern Iran in the 7th century BCE. They were the first Iranian-speaking people to build a significant state, and they did so in alliance with the Babylonians, with whom they jointly destroyed the Assyrian Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient world. In 612 BCE, the sack of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, was apparently quite thorough. The city never recovered. The Medes are somewhat shadowy in the historical record. Their own texts haven't survived in any significant form, and we know them mostly through the accounts of others, particularly the Greek historian Herodotus, who is informative, who also has a tendency to include stories that are colorful rather than necessarily accurate. Herodotus tells us that the Median king Deioces built his capital Ecbatana with 7 concentric walls painted in different colors, which is a wonderful detail that archaeologists have not yet been able to confirm or deny. The Medes were eventually superseded by the Persians, and specifically by Cyrus the Great, who in 550 BCE overthrew the last Median king, his own grandfather Astyages, and founded the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Which is where things get very interesting, because Cyrus the Great was not just a military conqueror. He was also, by the standards of ancient world conquerors, remarkably interesting in his approach to the people he conquered. We'll spend proper time with Cyrus and the Achaemenids in the next section. But for now, let's just note that the Iranian world that produced him, the world of Zoroastrian ethics, of Asha and Druj, of cosmic struggle and personal moral responsibility, seems to have contributed something to his approach to rulership. Whether Cyrus himself was a practicing Zoroastrian is naturally debated, but the cultural matrix from which he came was shaped by these ideas. Good thoughts, good words, good actions. When you rule an empire, that's actually a reasonably functional guiding principle. Let's take a moment to step back from Iran and India and look at the broader picture of the Indo-European world taking shape across the 2nd millennium BCE, because it's genuinely worth surveying. In the West, The descendants of those early corded ware and related steppe-influenced cultures were developing into what we now recognize as the precursors of the Celtic, Germanic, Italic, and other European linguistic traditions. The Bronze Age of Europe was a period of remarkable cultural exchange, with amber from the Baltic traded all the way to the Mediterranean, tin from Britain, and the Iberian Peninsula traveling to mix with copper from Cyprus or Central Europe to make the bronze that the age was named for. These trade networks connected Indo-European and non-Indo-European peoples in a web of exchange that moved not just goods but ideas, techniques, and stories. In Greece, or rather in the Aegean world, the Mycenaean civilization was reaching its peak around 1400 to 1200 BCE. The Mycenaeans spoke Greek, an Indo-European language, and we know this because they left behind writing. Their script, Linear B, was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, an architect who had learned Linear A as a teenager and simply never let the problem go. What he found when he cracked it was archaic Greek, the oldest written Greek we have. And what the tablets said was gloriously mundane. Inventories of sheep, records of grain allocation, lists of names and occupations. Not poetry, not history, accounting. Which is actually very useful for historians because it tells you what was actually happening day to day in a Bronze Age palace economy, rather than what the people who wrote the poetry wanted you to think was happening. The Mycenaeans built palace complexes, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, with massive cyclopean walls named for the mythological Cyclopes, because later Greeks couldn't believe humans had moved stones that large, sophisticated administrations who long-distance trade networks, and warrior elites who were buried with considerable pomp and armament. They were, in short, the people whose world would later be remembered and heavily mythologized in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Whether there was a historical Trojan War is another of those debates that never quite resolves. There was certainly a Troy. The archaeological site at Hisarlik in Turkey has been excavated repeatedly and does show evidence of destruction and reconstruction across several periods. There were certainly Mycenaean Greeks with the capability and motivation for overseas raiding and trading expeditions. But the specific war as Homer described, with its gods and heroes and 10-year siege, belongs to the domain of epic poetry rather than sober history. What is clear is that around 1200 BCE, the Mycenaean civilization collapsed, along with most of the other palatial civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Hittites in Anatolia, another Indo-European language group, by the way, collapsed. The Ugaritic civilization on the Syrian coast collapsed. Egypt survived but severely weakened. Cyprus was disrupted. This event, the Bronze Age collapse, is one of the great mysteries of ancient history, a near-simultaneous collapse of interconnected civilization across a wide region, apparently involving sea peoples, raiders of unknown origin, climate change and trade networks, disrupted trade networks, and possibly internal revolt. The exact causes and relative weight of each factor are still debated. The collapse ended the Mycenaean world, destroyed Linear B writing and the palace economy, and created the Greek Dark Ages, about 3 centuries of reduced population, reduced complexity and very little writing. And then, out of the Dark Ages, something new emerged. The world of the polis, the city-state, the alphabet, the philosophical tradition, the world that would eventually produce Socrates and Aristotle, but that's a story for another sleepy night. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, where the Hittites had been, the dust settled and new states emerged. And to the south, in the Levant and Mesopotamia, the first millennium BCE was becoming the age of successive great empires, the Neo-Assyrian, then the Neo-Babylonian, then the Persian. It is to the Persian Empire that we now turn. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, at its height, was the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. It stretched from the Aegean coast of modern Turkey to the borders of India, from the Caucasus to Egypt and Libya. It ruled over dozens of different peoples, speaking dozens of different languages, practicing dozens of different religions. Managing something like that requires either overwhelming violence or a fairly sophisticated administrative philosophy. The Persians, to their credit, tried, with some exceptions, to do it the second way. Cyrus the Great, founder of the empire, is one of the more genuinely interesting figures of the ancient world. After conquering the Medes in 550 BCE, he turned west and defeated the famously wealthy Lydian king Croesus in 547 BCE. Croesus had consulted the oracle at Delphi before the war, and the oracle told him that if he crossed the Halys River to attack Cyrus, he would destroy a great empire. He took this as encouragement, crossed the river, fought Cyrus, and discovered that the oracle was right. The great empire he destroyed was his own. This story, which Herodotus tells with evident pleasure, has the quality of a parable and may or may not be precisely what happened. But it has survived for 2,500 years because it is a very good story. Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BCE without, apparently, much of a siege. The Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus was deeply unpopular. He had a thing for the moon god Sin that didn't go over well with the Babylonian priesthood, who preferred their traditional Marduk-centered religion, and the city, according to Persian and Babylonian sources both, essentially opened its gates. Cyrus walked in and presented himself as the chosen of Marduk, the rightful king, the restorer of proper religious order. It was masterful political theater, and then he issued what is sometimes called the world's first declaration of human rights. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay cylinder inscribed with a proclamation of his policies after the conquest of Babylon. He freed the deported peoples from their exiles, including, according to the Hebrew Bible, the Jews who had been deported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. He allowed them to return to their homelands, to rebuild their temples, to practice their religions. He presented this not as tolerance, but as divine will. Marduk and Yahweh, in the Hebrew account, had chosen him to restore order. Modern scholars debate how to interpret the Cyrus cylinder. It is clearly also royal propaganda, and the human rights framing is partly anachronistic, but the practical policy it describes, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their religious and cultural identities rather than forcing assimilation, was genuinely unusual in the ancient world of empires. And it made the Persian Empire more stable than it would otherwise have been. In the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus is called the Anointed of God, the Messiah, in the Hebrew sense, because he allowed the return from Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. He is the only non-Israelite ever given that designation in the Hebrew Bible. That's a legacy. Cyrus died in 530 BCE, fighting somewhere in Central Asia on the eastern frontier of his empire. His body was brought back to his capital, Pasargadae, in Iran, where a modest but elegant tomb was built for him. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia 200 years later, he reportedly visited the tomb, found it had been ransacked, and was genuinely upset about it, ordering its restoration. Alexander had a complicated relationship with Cyrus. He admired him, modeled some of his own imperial ideology on him, and also dismantled his entire empire. But Alexander is for later. First, we have to get through Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, and the rest of the Achaemenid dynasty, all of whom have their own particular flavors of complicated. Cambyses, Cyrus's son and successor, conquered Egypt in 505 BCE, which was impressive. He also, according to Herodotus, went quite mad, stabbing a sacred Apis bull, desecrating temples, killing his own brother, and generally behaving in ways that Herodotus uses to make a point about the corrupting effect of tyranny and the importance of Greek sensibleness. Modern scholars are somewhat skeptical of the madness narrative, pointing out that Herodotus had his biases and that some of the alleged outrages may be Egyptian or Persian propaganda from sources hostile to Cambyses. What is clear is that Cambyses died in 522 BCE under mysterious circumstances while returning to Persia to deal with a rebellion. Whether it was suicide, an accident, or something else is unknown. The throne passed after a power struggle to Darius Avest, who was not directly in line but was connected to the Achaemenid family and who proved to be one of the most capable administrators the ancient world produced. Darius organized the empire into satrapies, administrative provinces, with governors and military commanders and royal inspectors who reported back to the center. He standardized weights and measures. He built roads, most famously the Royal Road, stretching from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in Iran, with relay stations for the royal couriers that allowed messages to travel the entire length in a week. He built a new capital, Persepolis, which even in ruins is one of the most impressive architectural sites on Earth. Persepolis. It's worth a moment. The Great Terrace of Persepolis with its Apadana, the audience hall where Darius and his successors received delegations from across the empire, has carved reliefs along its staircases showing delegations from every satrapy, each in their own distinctive dress, bringing gifts to the king. Elamites, Babylonians, Armenians, Arabians, Egyptians, Indians, Scythians, Libyans, and more, all shown in formal procession, all rendered with careful ethnographic detail. It's a visual empire, made in stone. It says, look at how many peoples we govern. Look at how orderly it is. Look at how they all come to us voluntarily with gifts. Whether they all came voluntarily is another matter. But as royal propaganda, it's extraordinarily accomplished. Darius also oversaw the first Persian attempt on mainland Greece, which ended at Marathon in 490 BCE with the famous Athenian victory that gave us both the Battle of Marathon and, eventually, the marathon race. Though the story of the runner Phidippides running to Athens to announce the victory and then dying is probably not exactly how it happened. There's a different account of Phidippides running from Athens to Sparta to ask for help before the battle, which is a longer distance and more plausible, and the ran to Athens and died story may be a later conflation. Darius didn't live long enough to try again. He died in 486 BCE, leaving his son Xerxes to finish the job. Xerxes. Now there's a figure who history has treated in interesting ways. He's the Persian king in the Book of Esther. Ahasuerus in the Hebrew text, almost certainly identifiable with Xerxes I. He's the god-king of the movie 300, depicted in a way that would have been baffling to the actual man. The real Xerxes was neither a god nor, by Persian accounts, a particularly supernatural presence. He was a king who inherited a massive empire, dealt with rebellions in Egypt and Babylon, and then led the largest invasion force the ancient world had assembled up to that point, against a collection of Greek city-states. The 480 BCE invasion of Greece is one of the most documented events of the ancient world, primarily because the Greeks wrote about it extensively and with great pride. The battles of Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea became foundational myths of Western civilization. The heroic defense of freedom against Eastern despotism, which is a framing that tells you more about later Western historiography than about what was actually happening. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and their allies held a narrow pass for 3 days against a massive Persian force, is the most famous of these. Even today, even to people who know nothing else about ancient history, the 300 Spartans and their Theban and Thespian allies who stayed to the end all died. Leonidas, the Spartan king, died, and then the Persians went south and burned Athens. Athens, which had been evacuated, was burned. The temples on the Acropolis were destroyed. And then, at the naval battle of Salamis, the Greek fleet, primarily Athenian, primarily under the strategy of Themistocles, decisively defeated the Persian fleet in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the mainland, because Xerxes had been maneuvered into fighting in a confined space where his numerical advantage couldn't fully apply. Xerxes reportedly watched the battle from a golden throne on the shore. He watched his fleet be defeated. He went home. The following year, the Persian land force was defeated at Plataea. The invasion was over. Xerxes never tried again. He returned to Persia and focused on building projects and court affairs. He was assassinated in 465 BCE by the commander of his bodyguard, in a palace conspiracy that may or may not have involved his own son, Artaxerxes. The details are murky. The Achaemenid Empire continued for another 130 years after Xerxes, through Artaxerxes I, Darius II, Artaxerxes II, and a succession of further kings, each with their own complicated court politics and succession crises and various revolts to manage. The empire remained large and powerful, but the administrative energy of the Darius period was hard to maintain. And then in 334 BCE, a 22-year-old Macedonian king crossed the Hellespont with about 37,000 men, and the world changed again. But that's a story for part 3. For now, let your breathing slow. The Achaemenid kings are resting in their unburned palaces, or rather, the ruins of their palaces, because Alexander would have something to say about that. The steppe winds are still blowing. The Kurgan mounds are still there in the grass. The world is old and slow, and you don't have to follow it anywhere tonight. Take a comfortable breath. We're still moving gently through this enormous canvas, the Indo-European world in all its complicated, sprawling, millennia-long story. We've come from the steppe, we've visited the Vedic priests and the Iranian prophets and the Persian kings. Now we arrive at the figure who, perhaps more than any other single person in ancient history, stretched the connections between East and West to their absolute limit, Alexander III of Macedon. Known as Alexander the Great, which is either an accurate description or remarkably good personal branding, depending on your mood. Alexander was Macedonian, which in the 4th century BCE was a somewhat complicated identity. To the Greeks of the southern city-states, Macedonians were semi-barbaric people from the north who spoke a dialect of Greek that was hard to understand and had a monarchy at a time when the respectable Greek world had moved on to various forms of democracy and oligarchy. To Alexander himself, he was absolutely Greek, the descendant of Heracles and Achilles, the heir to a Hellenic tradition that he carried with him like a torch into the Persian world. Philip II, Alexander's father, had already done the hard organizational and military work of turning Macedon into the dominant power in Greece, reorganizing the Macedonian army into the formidable phalanx-based force that Alexander would use to conquer the known world. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE, at his own daughter's wedding, of all places, in a scene of spectacular awkward timing, Alexander was 20 years old. He spent about 2 years consolidating his power in Greece and dealing with various people who thought the moment of transition was a good time to revolt. Then he crossed into Asia. What followed from 334 to 323 BCE is one of the most extraordinary sequences of military campaigns in recorded history. Not because Alexander was invincible, he wasn't. His campaigns were costly in lives, and he came close to disaster on more than one occasion. But because of the sheer geographic ambition of what he attempted and largely accomplished. He defeated the Persians at the Granicus River in 334 BCE, at Issus in 333 BCE, where he came face-to-face with the Persian king Darius III for the first time and thoroughly routed him, and at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, where Darius III fled the battlefield and was subsequently murdered by his own subordinates. Between these battles, Alexander conquered Egypt, where he was greeted as a liberator from Persian rule and officially declared a son of Amun-Ra by the oracle at Siwa, which he took very much to heart, and founded Alexandria, a city that would become one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. After Gaugamela, he took Persepolis and burned it. The burning of Persepolis is one of those actions that historians still debate. Ancient sources offer different accounts. Aryan says Alexander later regretted it as a misstep. Diodorus and Plutarch suggest it was done at the urging of an Athenian courtesan named Thyseis in a fit of celebratory drunkenness, which, if true, is one of the more remarkable anecdotes of the ancient world. The modern consensus tends toward the idea that it was a deliberate political act, a symbolic revenge for the Persian burning of Athens in 480 BCE. Whatever the reason, the great palace complex of Darius and Xerxes was left in the beautiful ruins that tourists visit today. Alexander pushed east and further east, through Bactria and Sogdiana, the regions of modern Afghanistan and Central Asia, where he fought some of the hardest campaigns of his career, guerrilla warfare in mountainous terrain against local chieftains who were not impressed by Macedonian phalanxes. He married a Bactrian noblewoman named Roxana, which was politically useful and apparently also genuinely something more than pure politics, given his later behavior toward her. He crossed the Hindu Kush, the great mountain range that separates Central Asia from South Asia, twice, which is not a casual undertaking. He reached the banks of the Indus River. He defeated the Indian king Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE, which was his last major pitched battle, and which involved war elephants on the Indian side, which the Macedonian cavalry horses found absolutely terrifying. Alexander managed this anyway, through tactical creativity, but it cost him. And then, on the banks of the Hyphasis River, what is now the Beas River in the Punjab, his army stopped. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years. They were in India, farther east than any Greek army had ever been, and they refused to go further. Alexander is said to have wept, though whether this was grief or frustration or theater is unclear. He turned back. The return journey was brutal. Part of the army went by sea, part through the Makran Desert, a route through one of the harshest environments in southern Asia that cost enormous casualties simply from heat, thirst, and starvation. Alexander himself was badly wounded during the siege of a city in the Indus region, struck by an arrow that pierced his lung. He survived, barely, and his survival was probably the only thing that prevented a complete collapse of morale and discipline. He reached Babylon in 323 BCE, and then he died. The cause of Alexander's death has been debated for 2,300 years. He was 32 years old. He had been drinking heavily for years and had sustained serious wounds. Some ancient sources mention a prolonged fever after a drinking party. Theories include typhoid fever, alcohol poison, liver failing, liver failure, a bias, and, always present in ancient history, assassination by poison. In 2019, a scholar proposed that he may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological condition based on ancient descriptions of his apparent slow death while remaining mentally aware, which would also explain why his body reportedly showed no signs of decomposition for 6 days. He may have been in a paralytic state rather than actually dead. Whatever happened, he was dead by June 323 BCE, and he had left no clear succession plan because he was 32 and probably assumed he had decades left. When his generals gathered around his bed and asked who should inherit the empire, he reportedly said, "The strongest," or, in some accounts, "to the best one." If he actually said this, it was a sentence that condemned the next generation of his followers to 40 years of war, which is exactly what happened. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors, were the brutal, complicated, decades-long series of conflicts through which Alexander's generals carved up his empire. Antigonus, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, Lysimachus. Each of them had served Alexander. Each of them had their own territorial ambitions and their own armies. and none of them was willing to accept a subordinate position to any of the others. Roxana and her son Alexander IV were murdered. Alexander's half-brother Philip III Aridaeus was murdered. Various generals and their families were killed in the usual ways. Eventually, by around 275 BCE, three main successor kingdoms had stabilized out of the chaos. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, founded by Ptolemy, who had been one of Alexander's closest friends and generals, and who made the rather shrewd decision to grab Egypt, one of the wealthiest and most defensible regions of the empire, and let the others fight over the less manageable bits. The Seleucid Empire, founded by Seleucus, which covered the bulk of Alexander's Asian conquests. Mesopotamia, Syria, Persia, and at its greatest extent, parts of Central Asia, and the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedon and Greece, the direct continuation of Alexander's Macedonian homeland. This period, roughly from Alexander's death in 323 BCE to the Roman conquest of the last Hellenistic kingdom with the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE, is called the Hellenistic period, and it is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated eras in ancient history. Hellenistic is the word scholars use for the culture that emerged from Alexander's conquests, a kind of Greek-influenced cultural coin, a shared language and artistic vocabulary and philosophical tradition that spread across an enormous geography. The lingua franca of the Hellenistic world was Greek, specifically Koine Greek, the simplified common dialect that had evolved from classical Attic Greek, and that would later be the language of the New Testament. You could travel from Alexandria to Antioch to Bactria and communicate in the same language with educated people in each city. But Hellenistic culture wasn't just Greeks imposing their culture on everyone else. It was a genuine mixing. Greek artistic forms absorbed Persian, Egyptian, and Indian influences. Local elites in Bactria and the Levant adopted Greek cultural forms while maintaining their own religious and cultural traditions. The Ptolemaic kings of Egypt presented themselves as pharaohs, complete with Egyptian dress and Egyptian titles, while also building Greek-style cities and sponsoring Greek intellectual culture. The Seleucids founded dozens of cities with Greek names across the Middle East, but the populations of these cities were complex cultural mixtures. Alexandria, Ptolemaic Egypt's capital on the Mediterranean coast, deserves particular attention. It was deliberately designed by Alexander as a great city, and it became one. The Ptolemies built the Mausion, the institution from which we get the word museum, a research institution that included the famous Library of Alexandria, arguably the greatest intellectual institution of the ancient world. Scholars at the library worked on everything: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, literature, geography. Euclid produced his Elements there. Eratosthenes, who was the chief librarian, calculated the circumference of the Earth with impressive accuracy, using nothing but the angles of shadows at different locations on the solstice, getting a result within a few percent of the correct value. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, 17 centuries before Copernicus. Herophilus and Erasistratus performed the first systematic human dissections and laid the foundations of anatomy. This was all happening in a city that had been built on a stretch of Egyptian coast by a Macedonian general who had been there for about 2 weeks before moving on to the next conquest. The intellectual efflorescence of Alexandria is partly testament to the quality of the Ptolemaic patronage, and partly a reminder that when you concentrate scholars, give them resources, and let them talk to each other, remarkable things happen. The library was never burned in a single dramatic fire, despite what the popular story suggests. It declined over several centuries through underfunding, neglect, and various smaller destructions, including one attributable to Julius Caesar's campaign in Alexandria. By the time the Arab conquest of Egypt came in 641 CE, there probably wasn't much left. Slow entropy rather than dramatic destruction, which is almost worse, in a way. Now, while the Hellenistic kingdoms were doing their thing in the West, something important was happening further east. In the part of Alexander's conquests that was hardest to hold and first to slip away, the regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, modern Afghanistan, and the surrounding Central Asian territories were part of the Seleucid Empire initially, but they were very far from Antioch, the Seleucid capital, and very difficult to control. Around 250 BCE, the Bactrian Greek governor, Diodotus, declared independence from the Seleucids, founding the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. This kingdom, Greeks ruling in Central Asia, surrounded by Iranian, Indian, and various other cultural influences, is one of the more fascinating political entities of the ancient world. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom eventually extended its reach into northwestern India, creating the Indo-Greek kingdom, a state in the Punjab and surrounding regions that was governed by kings with Greek names, but was thoroughly entangled with Indian political and cultural reality. The coins of these Indo-Greek kings are extraordinary artifacts. Greek legends on one side, Karosthi or Brahmi scripts on the other, Greek deities on one side, Indian deities on the other, bilingual, bicultural, standing astride two great civilizations. The most famous of these Indo-Greek kings was Menander I, who in Indian sources is called Milinda, and is the protagonist of a Buddhist philosophical dialogue called the Milinda Panha, the Questions of Milinda. In this text, a Greek king engages in a lengthy philosophical debate with the Buddhist monk Nagasena, asking penetrating questions about Buddhist philosophy. Whether Menander actually converted to Buddhism is unclear, but his coins show Buddhist symbols, and the Buddhist tradition remembers him fondly. A Greek-speaking king of Indian territories debating Buddhist philosophy in the 2nd century BCE is exactly the kind of thing the Hellenistic world was capable of producing. This brings us to Buddhism itself, which we should address briefly, because it emerged from the same South Asian world that the Vedic tradition had shaped, even as it challenged that tradition quite directly. Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, lived somewhere around 563 to 483 BCE, or 480 to 400 BCE, depending on which scholarly tradition you follow. The Theravada tradition uses the earlier dates. Chinese records suggest the later range. He was, according to the tradition, born into a Kshatriya family in the foothills of the Himalayas, in what is now southern Nepal. He was raised in wealth and comfort, married, had a son, and then, at some point in early adulthood, he encountered suffering. The traditional account describes him seeing an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a wandering ascetic, and decided to leave his comfortable life to find a way out of suffering. He spent years practicing extreme asceticism with a group of other seekers, which didn't work. He nearly starved himself to death. Then he accepted a bowl of rice from a village girl named Sujata, recovered, and sat under a tree at Bodh Gaya, the famous Bodhi tree, a people fig, until he had what he described as a complete understanding of the nature of reality. He was 35 years old. He spent the next 45 years teaching. What he taught was a middle way, a path between the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification, the Four Noble Truths, that life involves suffering, that suffering arises from craving and attachment, that it is possible to end suffering, and that the Eightfold Path, right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, leads to the end of suffering. Buddhism was, in significant ways, a critique of the Brahminical Vedic system. The Buddha rejected the authority of the Vedas as revealed scripture. He rejected the caste system as a determinant of spiritual worth. In the Sangha, the community of practitioners he founded, monks and nuns from all castes practiced together and were ranked by their spiritual seniority rather than their birth. He rejected the idea of a permanent, unchanging self, the Atman that the Upanishads identified with Brahman, proposing instead the doctrine of an Atman, not self. The idea that what we think of as a permanent self is actually a collection of constantly changing processes. This was radical stuff for its cultural context, and it clearly resonated because Buddhism spread with remarkable speed across South Asia and, eventually, across much of Asia. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, who ruled most of the Indian subcontinent from approximately 268 to 232 BCE, converted to Buddhism after the extraordinarily bloody Battle of Kalinga, which he had himself ordered, and which reportedly killed over 100,000 people and displaced many more. He was, by ancient accounts, genuinely horrified by what he had done. His conversion was not just personal. He made the promotion of Dharma, which he interpreted through a Buddhist lens. Though his edicts are careful not to be exclusively Buddhist into state policy, Ashoka had inscriptions carved on rocks and pillars all across his empire in multiple languages, including Greek and Aramaic in the western regions, spreading his messages about nonviolence, respect for all beings and religions, proper conduct toward parents, servants, and strangers, and the importance of truth. These Ashokan edicts are extraordinary documents. The words of a 3rd century BCE emperor, still readable, still concerned with the same moral questions that seem to recur in every human civilization. How should we treat each other? What do we owe to the weak and the suffering? What does a good ruler look like? One of the Greek Ashokan edicts, discovered in 1958 in Afghanistan, names Greek kings then ruling in the West, including Antiochus II of the Seleucids, Ptolemy II of Egypt, and others, as places where Ashoka had sent his messengers of Dharma. We don't know if these messengers had any effect, but the image of an Indian Buddhist emperor sending philosophical ambassadors to the Ptolemaic and Seleucid courts in the 3rd century BCE. That's the Hellenistic world, being even more interconnected than its most enthusiastic advocates usually describe. Let that float gently through your head as you breathe. A world of ideas moving as freely as trade goods, as freely as horses on a steppe. The same impulse that had moved those early Indo-European speakers outward from the Pontic grass was still moving, now carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of thought. We've covered a great deal of ground tonight, spatially and chronologically, from the Pontic steppe to the Punjab, from the Iranian plateau to the banks of the Hyphasis, from the hymns of the Rigveda to the edicts of Ashoka. All of it connected, all of it part of the same vast family story. The story of peoples and languages and ideas that set out from some common source and spread across an incomprehensible amount of geography, over an incomprehensible amount of time. In Part 4, we'll head back west to look at the European branches of this family tree, the Greeks and Romans and Celts and Germans, whose civilizations were shaped by these same Indo-European roots, and who each developed that inheritance in dramatically different and occasionally catastrophic ways. For now, the night is quiet, the steppe is still. The rivers of the Punjab are reflecting a sky that has 3,000 years' worth of undimmed stars in it. Rest here for a moment. Slowly now, let's drift westward. We've been spending a lot of time in Central and South Asia, and in the Iranian world, which is appropriate, because those civilizations are often under-discussed in the Western telling of the Indo-European story. But eventually we need to talk about the European branches, and specifically the two that dominated Western civilization's self-understanding for the next 2,000 years. Greece, Rome, two civilizations that spoke Indo-European languages, that preserved, in heavily modified and often unrecognizable form, some of those same ancient Proto-Indo-European ideas about sky gods and sacrifice and the heroic life, and that built things philosophically, legally, architecturally, that the modern world is still living in the shadow of. We'll start with Greece. Not from the beginning. We've already touched on Mycenaean Greece and the Bronze Age collapse. But from the world that emerged from that collapse, the archaic and classical Greek world of the city-states, the philosophers, the playwrights, and the remarkably dramatic political history, Greece's peculiar geography, a mountainous peninsula with countless offshore islands, limited agricultural land, and very long coastlines, produced a civilization of small, independent, often quarreling city-states, rather than a single unified empire. This was partly practical. The mountains made it hard to control large territories from a single center, and partly cultural. The Greeks prized the independence of the polis, the city-state, in a way that made political unity almost philosophically offensive to them. This had consequences. It meant that the Greeks competed ferociously with each other, militarily, economically, intellectually, athletically, dramatically. The same impulse that drove Athenian and Spartan armies to fight each other for decades also drove Athenian playwrights to compete at the festival of Dionysus, and Athenian philosophers to argue with each other in the agora, and Athenian historians to write careful accounts of events that everyone was still arguing about. The competitive spirit wasn't confined to any one domain. It was cultural. The Olympic Games, originally a religious festival at Olympia, in the Peloponnese, honoring Zeus, were held every 4 years from 776 BCE, and the Greeks from different city-states participated in them under a declared truce. The games brought together people who at other times of the year might be actively trying to kill each other. The categories of competition were martial, running, wrestling, the pentathlon, the pancration, but the context was religious and the status was civic. To win at Olympia was to bring honor to your city and, through your city, to your family and descendants. The victor's wreath, made of olive leaves, was worth more in social capital than gold. The classical period of Athens, roughly 500 to 323 BCE, is one of those rare moments in history where an improbable number of remarkable things happened in one place in a relatively short time. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides essentially invented Western tragedy. Aristophanes invented comedy, or at least elevated it to the level of literature. Herodotus invented history as we understand it, or at least gave it its first major practitioner. Thucydides took that invention and made it more rigorous and more pessimistic. Socrates wandered the agora, asking uncomfortable questions and getting executed for it. Plato developed the most systematic philosophy of the ancient Western world. Aristotle developed the foundations of logic, biology, physics, ethics, politics, and literary theory, which is a workload that should frankly make everyone else feel slightly inadequate. Phidias sculpted the Athena Parthenos and the Zeus at Olympia. Ictinus and Callicrates designed the Parthenon, a building so geometrically sophisticated and so subtly calibrated that almost nothing built since matches it technically. The city of Athens, under Pericles, became the cultural capital of the Mediterranean world, attracting talent and ideas from across the Greek world. It was also, of course, a slave society. Roughly a third of the population of Attica were enslaved people, without whose labor the economic base of Athenian culture could not have functioned. The same democracy that we admire in Pericles' funeral oration, where he describes Athens as a city where power is in the hands of many rather than the few, excluded women, foreigners, and enslaved people. The we in Athenian democratic rhetoric was always a narrow we. Ancient history is full of these uncomfortable qualifications, and it's worth sitting with them rather than footnoting them away. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, was the great self-destruction of classical Greece. Athens and Sparta, the two dominant powers of the Greek world, and their respective alliance networks, fought each other for 27 years. Thucydides wrote the history of this war with a clarity and analytical depth that has never been surpassed as a work of political history. He understood, writing in the 5th century BCE, that the fundamental cause of the war was Spartan fear of growing Athenian power, a dynamic he called the Thucydides trap in modern renditions, and which political scientists still invoke to describe great power competition today. Athens lost. The plague that struck Athens early in the war and killed perhaps a quarter of its population, including Pericles himself, was a significant blow. The catastrophic Sicilian expedition of 415 to 413 BCE, in which Athens sent its largest ever fleet to conquer Sicily and lost almost the entire force, was a disaster of ambition and miscalculation that effectively ended Athenian naval supremacy. In 404 BCE, Athens surrendered, and its walls were pulled down to the music of flutes, according to Xenophon, which is the kind of detail that makes ancient history briefly and painfully specific. Athens recovered eventually. It never quite regained its 5th century dominance, but it remained the intellectual center of the Greek world for centuries. The philosophical schools of the 4th century and later, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, the Stoic school in the Stoa Poikile, the Epicurean garden, made Athens into a kind of university city where wealthy young men from across the Mediterranean world came to study. Stoicism deserves a moment, because it is probably the most durable and directly influential philosophical tradition that emerged from the Hellenistic world. In terms of its reach into modern life, the Stoics were founded by Zeno of Citium, who came to Athens from Cyprus around 300 BCE and began teaching in the painted Stoa, the Stoa Poikile, which is where the name comes from. The core Stoic teaching is in simplified form. There are things in your control and things not in your control. The things in your control are your own thoughts, judgments, and responses. The things not in your control are everything else: other people's behavior, external circumstances, health, wealth, reputation, life, and death. Wisdom consists in focusing your concern entirely on what is in your control and accepting with equanimity everything that is not. This sounds simple, and it is simple, and it is also one of the hardest things to actually practice. The Stoics developed it with considerable philosophical rigor over several generations, and in Rome, where Stoicism became enormously popular in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. It produced figures like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, whose Meditations is still read and still capable of being genuinely useful to a 21st century reader in ways that most ancient texts require considerable translation to achieve. The Stoics also held that all human beings share in a divine reason, the Logos, and are therefore fundamentally equal in their rational capacity. The distinction between Greek and barbarian, between free and enslaved, was morally irrelevant to the Stoics. Epictetus, who was one of the most influential Stoic teachers, was himself a freedman. He had been enslaved. His philosophical authority rested on his thought, not his social status. This was radical, if not always followed through in practice. Rome. Let's begin the approach to Rome, which is a topic that requires a certain commitment of narrative energy, even delivered at our calm and sleep-friendly pace. The Romans spoke Latin, an Indo-European language of the Italic branch. They lived in a city on the Tiber River in central Italy that they believed was founded in 753 BCE by Romulus, who had killed his twin brother Remus in a dispute about city walls, and then populated his city partly by kidnapping women from the neighboring Sabines, an event known with considerable historical euphemism as the rape of the Sabine women. This founding myth tells you something about the Romans. They had a talent for organizing violence into civic narrative. The early Roman state was a monarchy, then became a republic around 509 BCE, when the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, was expelled after his son assaulted a noblewoman named Lucretia, who subsequently died. The republic with its consuls and senate and complex system of magistracies and written laws, lasted roughly 5 centuries, during which Rome conquered first the Italian peninsula, then the Western Mediterranean, then the Eastern Mediterranean, and then large portions of Western Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. The story of Roman conquest is simultaneously impressive and unpleasant, as most stories of conquest are. Rome was extraordinarily good at war. Its legions, its discipline, its tactical flexibility, its logistical organization, but also extraordinarily good at incorporation. Conquered peoples could, over time, become Romans. Latin spread, Roman law spread, Roman engineering spread, the roads, the aqueducts, the sewers. These were tools of empire and also genuinely useful infrastructure, and their legacy is still visible in Europe and North Africa and the Near East in physical traces and in legal and linguistic inheritance. The Roman relationship with the Greek world is one of the most interesting cultural dynamics of the ancient world. Rome conquered Greece militarily. The final annexation of the Greek peninsula came with the sack of Corinth in 146 BCE, but was, in the famous phrase of the poet Horace, conquered by captive Greece. Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek literature, Greek medicine, Greek architecture, all of these poured into Rome after the conquest and fundamentally shaped what Roman high culture became. Educated Romans were bilingual in Latin and Greek. Roman children were educated by Greek tutors. Roman aristocrats collected Greek art and built in Greek architectural styles. The gods were quietly merged. Zeus became Jupiter, Ares became Mars, Aphrodite became Venus, and so on through the Olympian pantheon. The old Indo-European sky deity, so far back in the family tree, was still there in Jupiter's name. We've come full circle from those Vedic Dios Pitta hymns. The same grandfather, recognized through different faces across an enormous distance. Roman religion was, in practice, extremely tolerant of diverse religious traditions, as long as those traditions also acknowledged the Roman gods and participated in the official cult. The Jews were a persistent exception and source of tension because their monotheism made the required acknowledgement of Roman gods impossible. The Christians, who initially were considered a subset of Judaism, inherited this tension and amplified it. The Roman Republic's end is one of the most thoroughly documented political crises in ancient history, largely because it produced several of antiquity's greatest writers who were participants in it. Cicero, the orator and statesman, whose letters and speeches give us an almost daily diary-level account of the late Republic's collapse. Julius Caesar, who wrote about his own wars with a clarity and a third-person self-aggrandizement that remains distinctive. Sallust. Livy. The sources are rich and partisan and cross-examining each other across 2,000 years. The Republic collapsed for many reasons that scholars have been arguing about since Gibbon and before. Social inequality, the breakdown of the unwritten norms that govern political competition, the concentration of wealth and military power in too few hands, the disenfranchisement of the Italian allies until too late, the use of private armies by competing aristocrats. Julius Caesar, who crossed the Rubicon with his legions in 49 BCE and thereby started a civil war, was not the cause of the Republic's death. He was more like the man who walked through a door that had already been rotting for decades. Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, in the theater of Pompeii, not the Senate building, by a conspiracy of senators led by Brutus and Cassius who believed, apparently sincerely, that they were saving the Republic. They were not. The assassination led to another civil war, which led eventually to the victory of Caesar's adopted son Octavian over Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor, and the Republic became the Empire, and the world changed again. Augustus is one of the great political geniuses of human history, which is a somewhat unsettling thing to say about a man who won a civil war and then installed himself as permanent ruler of the Mediterranean world. He was careful. He kept the forms of the Republic, the Senate, the magistracies, the elections, while systematically draining them of real power. He called himself not king or emperor, but princeps, first citizen, and pater patriae, father of the fatherland. He cultivated the image of a humble servant of the state while operating as an absolute monarch. He also ended the civil wars that had been tearing the Roman world apart for decades, oversaw an unprecedented period of prosperity and building. The historian Suetonius records that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, which may be slightly exaggerated but directionally accurate, patronized the greatest writers of Latin literature, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Livy, and presided over what became known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which would last, in various forms and with various interruptions, for about 2 centuries. That the Pax Romana was a peace enforced by overwhelming military power, and that it was experienced rather differently by people on the Roman frontier than by residents of the city of Rome, is worth noting. The Gallic and British and Dacian and Jewish populations who experienced Roman peace did not always use that word for it. We could spend many more hours on Rome, on the emperors both competent and catastrophic, on the development of Roman law, which underlies most of the legal systems of continental Europe today, on the spread of Christianity, from a small Jewish sect in the provinces to the official religion of the empire, on the gradual transformation of the Western Roman Empire and its eventual disappearance from the map in 476 CE. But we should also spare some attention for the other European branches of the Indo-European family, the Celts and the Germans, because their story is part of this canvas too, and it tends to get treated as background noise to the classical civilizations. The Celts, Celtic-speaking peoples, were widespread across Europe from roughly 800 BCE onward, from the British Isles and the Iberian Peninsula to Central Europe and Galatia in modern Turkey. At the height of their expansion in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Celtic-speaking peoples occupied an enormous swath of the continent. They sacked Rome in 390 BCE, which the Romans remembered with considerable trauma. They sacked Delphi in 279 BCE, which the Greeks remembered similarly. They settled throughout the Po Valley in northern Italy, which the Romans called Cisalpine Gaul. They were warriors, metalworkers, traders, farmers, priests. The Celtic religious tradition was maintained by a priestly caste called the Druids, about whom we know frustratingly little because they maintained their knowledge through oral tradition rather than writing. What we know comes largely from Greek and Roman sources, who were not always neutral or accurate observers. The Druids were apparently responsible for religious ritual, legal memory, poetry, history, and education. They trained for up to 20 years. They believed in the transmigration of souls, which the Romans and Greeks noted as a philosophical position worthy of respect, even if they found some Druidic practices alarming. Celtic art, at its peak in the Latène period, roughly 450 to 1 BCE, is extraordinary, a swirling, abstract, zoomorphic style quite different from the naturalistic art of Greece and Rome. The metalwork, the torques, the decorated shields and helmets and mirrors have a visual sophistication that deserves to be called high art rather than tribal craft, and increasingly it is. The Germanic peoples, speakers of Germanic languages, the ancestral group of modern German, English, Dutch, the Scandinavian languages, and others, occupied the forests and plains of northern Europe and interacted with Rome along the Rhine and Danube frontiers with an intensity that shaped both civilizations. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE, in which a Germanic chieftain named Arminius led a coalition that destroyed three entire Roman legions in an ambush, permanently halted Roman expansion east of the Rhine. Augustus reportedly cried out, "Varus, give me back my legions," when he heard the news, Quintilius Varus being the general he'd lost. The Rhine-Danube line became the permanent northern frontier of the Roman Empire in the west. Arminius is a figure of considerable later significance. In 19th century Germany, he became Hermann der Cherusker, a national symbol of Germanic independence, and enormous statues of him were built. The projection of modern nationalist identity onto ancient tribal leaders is a recurring habit of history, and it tends to say more about the people doing the projecting than about the ancient person being projected onto. The Germanic peoples north of the frontier developed their own rich traditions, the beginnings of the mythological world that would eventually produce the Norse myths of Odin, Thor, Freyja, and the rest. These myths, like the Vedic and Iranian traditions, preserve traces of ancient Proto-Indo-European religious concepts. The Sky Father figure, the divine twins, the sacred drink, the cosmic tree, Yggdrasil, the great ash tree at the center of Norse cosmology, has an ancestor in the world tree concept that appears across the Indo-European world. Odin's sacrifice of himself to himself on the tree, in exchange for wisdom, echoes the ancient Vedic concept of sacrifice as the cosmic mechanism by which knowledge and power are exchanged. The family resemblance is there, 3,000 years later, still traceable in the mythology of the Viking Age. By this point in our journey, we've traveled from the Pontic Steppe to India and back, through Persia and Greece and Rome, and the forests of northern Europe. We've seen how a series of migrations and language spreads and cultural exchanges, beginning with people who had horses and wheels and an ancient sky god whose name we can reconstruct, produced an astonishing diversity of civilizations, all of them bearing the family mark. And now we have to address something we've been carefully circling: the modern history of the concept of Aryan. Because this story has a shadow, and the shadow is long and dark, and it belongs in a history that wants to be side honest. We're going to slow down even further here. This part isn't about drama or excitement, just a calm and clear account of how a legitimate academic concept became one of the most catastrophically misused ideas in modern history. The linguistic and archaeological study of Indo-European origins is a real and respectable field. It has been pursued honestly by many scholars, and the conclusions about language families, migrations, and cultural connections that we've discussed tonight are based on genuine evidence. None of that is in doubt. What happened alongside it, and partly entangled with it, is something different. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European scholars began to understand the Indo-European language family, a temptation arose to interpret that linguistic relationship as racial relationship. If Sanskrit and Latin and Greek descended from a common ancestor language, did that mean the people who spoke those languages were related racially? And if they were, what did that imply about their comparative worth, their comparative intelligence, their comparative fitness to rule? You can see where this is going. The German Romantic movement of the early 19th century was deeply interested in national origins and racial character. Figures like Friedrich Schlegel applied the new comparative linguistics to a project of national mythology. The idea that the Germans, and more broadly the Aryan peoples, had a superior spiritual and intellectual heritage that distinguished them from other groups. This was not science. It was ideology wearing the costume of science, which is a particular kind of dangerous. The term Aryan, which, remember, in ancient usage referred to cultural self-identification among ancient Indians and Iranians, was repurposed by European scholars and ideologues to refer to the ancestral Indo-European population, and then further repurposed to mean a supposed racial type characterized by Northern European physical features: light skin, light hair, light eyes, tall stature. This physical description had essentially no connection to what ancient Vedic or Avestan peoples actually looked like, or to each other, for that matter, since light-featured Northern European described a very different population from ancient Iranian. The scholar Max Muller, who was one of the most important figures in 19th century Indology, and who did genuine and important work in comparative mythology, spent his later career trying to walk back the racial interpretation of the Aryan concept. "I have declared again and again," he wrote toward the end of his life, "that if I say Arius, I mean neither blood, nor bones, nor hair, nor skull. I mean simply those who speak an Aryan language." He was largely ignored on this point by the people who found the racial interpretation useful. Count Arthur de Gobineau, a French aristocrat writing in the 1850s, produced his essay on the inequality of human races, which developed a full pseudo-scientific racial hierarchy, placing what he called the Aryan race at the top. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, a British-born German naturalized writer who married Richard Wagner's daughter, developed these ideas further in his enormously influential 1899 work, The Foundations of the 19th Century, which mixed racial mysticism, anti-Semitism, and proto-fascist ideology into a cocktail that was widely read in Germany, and became one of the intellectual antecedents of National Socialism. And then, in the 20th century, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist movement in Germany adopted the Aryan mythology as central doctrine. The Aryan race, in Nazi ideology, was defined primarily by what it was not Jewish, not Romani, not black, not Slavic, and it was held to be the pinnacle of human civilization, uniquely threatened by racial contamination. This ideology, as everyone knows, and as no one should need to have explained, led to the Holocaust. The systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others, including Roma, disabled people, gay people, and political opponents. The word Aryan carries this history. It cannot be separated from it in modern usage without extreme care and explicit context. That is why scholars of Indo-European studies largely prefer the term Proto-Indo-European for the ancestral culture and Indo-European for the language family, and why the ancient self-designation Aryan is used in academic work only in carefully delimited historical contexts. The ancient usage was legitimate. The 19th and 20th century racial usage was not. The other piece of this history that deserves attention is the swastika. The swastika, the hooked cross symbol, is one of the most ancient decorative motifs in human history, found across the Indo-European world from India to Europe, from the Indus Valley to pre-Christian Scandinavia. In Sanskrit, swastika means something like good fortune or well-being. It appears on the seals of the Indus Valley civilization, on the pottery of the Neolithic Vinca culture in the Balkans, on ancient Greek artifacts in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain religious art, in the folk art of many cultures. It was a symbol of good luck, of the sun, of cosmic order. The Nazi adoption of the swastika, which Hitler described in Mein Kampf as the symbol of the Aryan struggle, has permanently contaminated the symbol in Western contexts. It is now functionally unusable as a positive symbol in Europe, North America, and much of the world, even though it remains a sacred religious symbol in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions, where it has been used for thousands of years and will continue to be used. This is one of the peculiar ways that history bleeds into the present, an ancient symbol of universal good fortune, carrying 4,000 years of benign usage, now divided into those who can use it freely, because their tradition predates and has nothing to do with National Socialism, and those for whom it will always first trigger the image of the Nazi regime. The symbol itself is innocent. The history is not. The encounter between Aryan studies and Nazi ideology also had a specific archaeology. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was obsessed with finding physical evidence of the Aryan master race's ancient superiority and worldwide influence. He established a research institute called the Ahnenerbe Ancestral Heritage that sent expeditions to Tibet, to Iceland, to the Middle East, looking for traces of an ancient Aryan civilization. These expeditions were pseudoscience. They found nothing that supported their premise, but they did damage by associating serious archaeology and anthropology with Nazi ideology. They poisoned the well for genuine scholarship in these areas for decades. Even today, fringe theories about Aryan origins and ancient history continue to circulate in white nationalist and neo-Nazi contexts. They claim ancient Aryans built the Egyptian pyramids, or colonized the Americas, or were the original inhabitants of every civilization worth admiring. These theories are false. They are contradicted by overwhelming evidence from genetics, archaeology, and linguistics. And they are dangerous, not because of their absurdity, but because of the way they use the surface appearance of scholarly inquiry to disguise ideology. The actual story of the Indo-European migrations and the ancient Aryan-speaking civilizations is far more interesting than any of these mythologies, precisely because it is true, and because it shows not a master race superior to all others, but a complex, mixed, diverse series of migrations and cultural exchanges in which no single group has a monopoly on achievement or sophistication. The Vedic priests who composed the Rigveda and the Dravidian heritage, people who had built the Indus Valley civilization, were both brilliant. The Zoroastrian reformers and the Mesopotamian astronomers they learned from were both brilliant. The Greek philosophers and the Egyptian mathematicians and the Babylonian astronomers and the Indian logicians were all brilliant. Civilization is collaborative across time and across cultures. That is the actual lesson of the evidence. It's a lesson worth sitting with in the dark, quietly, without anyone raising their voice. The Pontic Steppe people didn't know they were going to produce both the Rigveda and the Iliad and the Avesta and Roman law and Norse mythology. They were just living on the grass with their horses and their cattle. The movement of ideas and peoples that resulted from their migrations was larger than any of them could have imagined, and it produced things both beautiful and terrible, as all huel of human history does. Understanding where we came from, clearly, accurately, without the distortions of nationalism or racism or romantic mythology, is one of the things history is for, not to make us proud of our ancestors or ashamed of them, but to understand how we became what we are, and what that means for how we might choose to go forward. We're in the final stretch now. The night has been long and the distances covered have been enormous. Let's begin to gather the threads. We've traveled from roughly 4500 BCE, the Pontic Steppe, the Proto-Indo-European homeland, to the 1st century CE, covering migrations, empires, philosophies, religions, languages, and one catastrophically misused academic concept. Now let's spend some quiet time looking at how all of these threads continued. The slow river of the Indo-European inheritance flowing forward through the first millennium CE and, in some cases, right up to the present day. The most continuous living tradition from the ancient Aryan-speaking world is the Vedic tradition of South Asia, which survives today in Hinduism, not unchanged. Hinduism, as practiced today, is a synthesis of Vedic tradition, the Upanishadic philosophical revolution, the devotional bhakti movement, the influence of Buddhism and Jainism, regional traditions, and centuries of development. But the core texts are still there. The Rigveda is still recited. The ritual system of the ancient Vedic tradition, modified and elaborated, continues in the form of puja and temple worship, and the great festivals of the Hindu calendar. Sanskrit, the language of the Vedas, is still used in religious contexts, still taught in traditional schools, the Gurukul system, still studied by scholars worldwide. It is a liturgical and scholarly language in the way that Latin was for medieval Europe, no longer a first language for most, but alive in a different and important sense. Zoroastrianism, the religion of the ancient Iranian world, survived the Islamic conquest of Persia in the 7th century CE, though in reduced form. A significant community fled to India, the Parsis, settled primarily in and around Mumbai, Bombay. Today, the Parsi community is small, but historically significant. They contributed disproportionately to Indian business, culture, and intellectual life in the colonial and post-colonial periods. The Tata industrial family, one of the most important in Indian business history, is Parsi. The composer and musician Freddie Mercury of the band Queen was born Farrokh Bulsara to a Parsi from Gujarat. Zubin Mehta, the conductor, Homi Bhabha, the physicist who led India's nuclear program. The community is small, perhaps 60,000 people in India today, and its population is declining. The ancient tradition of Ahura Mazda and the eternal struggle of Asha against Druj continues quietly in fire temples in Gujarat and Mumbai and Toronto and Chicago. Zoroastrian communities also survive in Iran. The Zartoshtis, smaller even than the Parsi community, but present in cities like Yazd and Kerman and Tehran. They have maintained their tradition through 14 centuries of non-Zoroastrian rule, which is its own kind of remarkable persistence. The Buddhist tradition founded in the ancient Vedic world of South Asia is now one of the world's great religions, with estimated adherents of 500 million or more. It spread from its origins in the Gangetic Plain of northern India across South and Southeast Asia, through Central Asia along the Silk Road, into China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, and eventually into the Western world. Every iteration has been adapted and modified by its new context. Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, Mahayana Buddhism in East Asia, Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet. But all of them trace back to that man sitting under the pipal tree at Bodhi Gaya somewhere around the 5th century BCE. The Bodhi tree at Bodhi Gaya, or rather a descended cutting of it, since the original is long gone, is still there. People still meditate under it, still seek, in some sense, the same understanding that Siddhartha sought. The continuity across 2,500 years is genuinely remarkable. The Greek philosophical tradition, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Epicurean, flowed forward through several channels. The Islamic Golden Age of the 8th through 13th centuries CE preserved and extended Greek philosophical and scientific work, with Arabic scholars translating and commenting on Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, and many others. The Islamic philosophical tradition, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, is in significant part a continuation and development of the Greek tradition, adapted and transformed by Islamic theological context. This work flowed back into Europe through medieval Spain. The translation movement in Toledo, where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked together to translate Arabic works into Latin, and through contact in Sicily and the Crusader states. The medieval European university system built its curriculum substantially on Aristotle, as recovered and transmitted through Arabic scholarship. Scholastic philosophy, Albertus Magnus, Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, is a conversation between Aristotelian logic and Christian theology, mediated by Islamic scholarship. The Indo-European languages of Europe also preserved and transmitted Greek and Latin learning. The Romance languages descended from Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, are spoken today by over 700 million people. Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian, and their many dialects carry the Indo-European inheritance through Roman and Latin channels. The Germanic languages, English, German, Dutch, the Scandinavian languages, carry it through the Northern European branch. The Slavic languages, Russian, Polish, Czechs, Serbian, and many others, carry it through another Indo-European branch that we haven't had time to properly visit tonight. The Indo-Iranian languages, Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Persian, Pashto, and many others, carry it through the branch that went east and south from the steppe. The number of people speaking Indo-European languages today is estimated at roughly 3 billion, nearly half the world's population. A language family that began with a group of steppe pastoralists 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. The numeral 1, 2, 3 that you learned as a child, in whatever Indo-European language you grew up with, connects you through a chain of unbroken linguistic transmission to the Vedic priests counting their cattle offerings, to the Roman magistrates tallying their census, to the Zoroastrian poets numbering the holy immortals. The word father in your language, pitar, pater, pater, padre, per, vater, connects you to the Proto-Indo-European word that those Pontic steppe people used for their fathers before horses were ridden and before wheels were invented. This is what languages are. Time machines, carrying the past invisibly inside the present. Every time you say a word, you're pronouncing something that has been pronounced in slightly different forms by an unbroken chain of human mouths going back thousands of years. The mathematics that underlies modern science came substantially from two Indo-European traditions, the Greek geometric and logical tradition, and the Indian algebraic and positional numeral tradition. The decimal positional number system that the entire modern world uses, including the zero, that crucial concept was developed in India in the mathematical tradition that grew from the Vedic world. The numerals are called Arabic numerals in English because they came to Europe via the Islamic mathematical tradition, but they originated in India. Without them, the scientific and technological civilization we live in would not have been possible in its current form. Al-Khwarizmi, the 9th century Persian mathematician working in Baghdad, developed algebra. The word algebra comes from the title of his book, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala. Algorithm is a Latinization of his name. He was building on Greek, Babylonian, and Indian mathematical traditions. Persian-speaking, working in an Arabic language scholarly tradition, drawing on Greek and Indian sources, creating the mathematical foundations of modern computing. The entanglement of civilizations is present in every calculation your phone performs. And then there is the question of the ancient world's environmental legacy, which a full-length history must address at least briefly. The agricultural and pastoral systems of the ancient Indo-European world, the clearing of forests for crops and grazing, the intensive cultivation of river valleys, the introduction of domesticated animals to new ecosystems, had significant environmental consequences that played out over millennia. The deforestation of the Mediterranean basin, documented by ancient writers, to describe regions that were forested in their grandfather's time now being bare hillsides, is partly the result of the intensive exploitation of the classical world. The salinization of Mesopotamian soils from millennia of irrigation contributed to the decline of agricultural productivity in the ancient heartland. These are not unique to the Indo-European world. Human civilizations everywhere have modified their environments, often in ways that eventually undermine themselves. But it is part of the honest accounting that a complete history requires. Let's return, in these final quiet minutes, to where we began: the steppe, the grass, the low burial mounds of the Yamnaya scattered across the plains of Ukraine and Russia, visible from the road if you know what to look for. The people who built those mounds lived for their moment and then passed. They left no literature, no philosophy, no named buildings. They left bones sometimes in the earth. They left the traces of their language in the languages their descendants spoke, which eventually became the languages in which the Vedas and the Avesta and the Iliad and the Aeneid and Hamlet and the Masnavi and the Canterbury Tales were written. They left, if the genetic evidence is to be believed, something of themselves in the biology of billions of people alive today, in the proportions varying across different regions and populations, mixed and remixed over hundreds of generations with all the other ancient lineages that had been living in their respective places for much longer. They didn't know they were the Proto-Indo-Europeans. They didn't know they were going anywhere in particular. They were just following the grass and the seasons and the horses. History, at its grandest scale, has this quality of accidental enormity. The movements that change the world don't know they're changing the world. The people who compose the words that last 3,000 years are just people, talking, thinking, trying to understand a universe that resists understanding. The philosophers who ask the questions that echo through millennia are mostly just people in conversation with each other in their particular moment, in their particular place. What connects them? What connects the Vedic seer and the Greek philosopher and the Zoroastrian prophet and the Buddhist monk and the Stoic emperor is not race, not blood, not any romantic mythology of superior peoples. It is the same impulse that makes you, right now, in whatever year you are, listening to a slow voice describing the ancient world in the dark. The desire to understand where you came from and what it means, and whether any of it adds up to something that makes sense. It doesn't always add up. History rarely does, but the attempt is worth making. The questions are worth asking. The connections are worth following. Back through time, back through languages, back through the slow river of human thought to wherever it begins, which is always somewhere further back than you expected, always mixed with more traditions than you thought, always more complicated and more interesting than any simple story would have it. The ancient Vedic sunrise hymn, the Usha Sukta, those beautiful hymns to the dawn goddess, says something like, "She comes again as she always comes, rousing every living creature. She is eternal, she is new. She has come before and she will come again." 3,000 years ago, still there, still, in some sense, coming. That's enough history for one night. The lights can stay where they are. The blanket can stay where it is. The slow river keeps moving, as it always does, whether we're watching it or not. Sleep well.